Okay, so we will try to open up as soon as possible to questions from the audience, because I think there should be quite a few. But I have at least one or two questions, maybe to all of them. One is related to material. So what we are, sometimes I got the impression maybe we step too fast here. We're just throwing a lot of possible art references onto games and hope they stick. Maybe not all of them stick. And maybe one of the points where they don't stick is the question of material. Material and media, to be precise. Having Jay Bolter here, I can't avoid talking about mediation. So my question to all four of you is the translation that you're trying to do, for example, from sports to World of Warcraft, or from Fluxus to game design, or from avant-garde, different avant-garde systems to computer games. Does that really take into account that something like basketball has grown? Like a player like, oh, let's golf, because we talked about golf before. A player like Tiger Woods suddenly applied different physique, a different body to the game that was not there before, that is not on your 16 rules of the, or 13 rules of the original game. Same with Fluxus. The idea that you had the card that Brecht would make, and we look at the card and the screenshot of the card, which is completely different from the process as you outlined, or in avant-garde art, where we would reuse pieces of material. Another nice example are the ready-mades. They are very material, very there. So does that really translate this easily, as you suggest, into the way that we deal with video games? And if so, why, or why not?
Well, I guess from my perspective, I mean, it's a pretty pervasive approach in all my work to go back as far as possible, because I think we have this unfortunate kind of historical amnesia, and there's a lot of writing even now in game studies in particular, and game art, which is why I showed Alien Garden and Mike Built a Shelter, is that as if all of this stuff was invented 3 years ago. And the reason I showed all the Fluxus work is because a lot of the ideas, a lot of the practices that we see in game art have some precedent in Flux work. I mean, Le Cadeau is a mod of an iron, right? It's taking an existing consumer product and modifying it. And I think that's, to me, I reject the notion that everything that happens in digital media is original. I think it always builds on prior traditions and prior practices. And I'm really glad people brought up the Western thing, because as well as cultural positions and biases.
Well, for me, I think it's the shortest step, because basketball is in fact a game, and there are many digital games about basketball. But of course, on the other hand, it's a little. This is going to be a little bit.
None about women's basketball.
None that I know. It's true. Very true. And actually, that would be a really interesting. Well, okay, I won't get this. I will not allow myself to be distracted by that, because there's an interesting point that could be made about
But
that.
it would be an interesting point for the body and the material.
Yeah.
How does that get mediated? Because it's a big topic, right?
Well, that's the dialectic. Okay, sports they're both games. They're very close to each other. However, you could argue that basketball is in some ways they're the farthest apart, because basketball seems to be at first to be entirely about bodies. But the point I guess I was trying to make is there are these two aspects to the beautiful in sports. There is this external aspect, which is about bodies, but there's also this interior of the game, which is built around ways of understanding the process and the ways people solve problems that are very similar to the ways we talk about game design and how players might understand that. So that in fact, what we end up with, I think, is that digital games can correspond very nicely and I would say are pretty close to identical in the way they're appreciated to that internal side of the appreciation of sports, but we do not have an analog. In fact, we still are very far apart as far as the external embodied side of sports. I don't think it's possible at this time, really, except in a digital game that involves bodies, to create a beautiful individual play in the same way that you can in sports. Can I say one thing about women's basketball? So the interesting thing about that is that the prejudice that a lot of guys who don't watch women's basketball have against women's basketball is that it's not an interesting physical sport. Interestingly, women's basketball is at least the equal of men's basketball on the internal side of the game. Most women players are much better at some of the fundamental aspects, many of the strategic and tactical aspects of the game, but the prejudice you mostly hear against it is, they're not dunking, they're not playing above the rim, that kind of thing. And I just wonder, that's kind of interesting, because the side that's conducive to digital games is there in women's basketball, which is the internal part of the game, but it's because of the argument about the embodied side of basketball, I'm guessing, that there isn't a women's basketball game. It seems kind of strange to me. I think women's basketball would easily make a very good digital game.
There was actually a women's basketball board game in the mid-1800s.
Oh, mid-1800s.
Just
anyway.
I'm not sure, Michael, I understand your question, so I'll answer the question that I want to.
What a surprise.
About materiality, which is that it seems to me relatively easy to make and to draw the analogy between what we were calling the formal avant-garde's preoccupation with trying to find the essence of the medium in painting, in film, in sculpture, in other forms of visual arts, and the preoccupation with what is the essence of the game, which is a discourse that goes on. We saw it this morning. It's one that is very strong in the game community. Our games. Is narrative part of the essence of the game, or do we banish that as not being essential to the game? Is it procedurality? What about this contested term interactivity? These kinds of debates remind me very much of similar debates about, what is the essence of painting, or what is the essence of film?
But isn't the difference that, as John helped point out, discourse is about painting has been around for at least 500 years, whereas although games are at least as ancient as
The discourse I'm talking about, I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
For people making games, we're still trying to figure out how to speak about our discipline, how to bridge theory and practice, and so, I'm of two minds. I'm sympathetic. I mean, I grew up in this sort of postmodern era and wish to sort of deconstruct my medium, but at the same time, game creators want to understand what it is that they're doing in a more traditional craft way.
Well, but the discourse I'm talking about is the discourse of high modernism, which, really is about 50, 60 years old. Well, it starts a little earlier with Clement Greenberg, to some extent other of the high modernists, like Adorno. But it's very much a 20th century phenomenon. And in particular, the American version of it centered on the abstract expressionists in the 1950s and Clement Greenberg as a spokesman for that. And then the debate that grew up around that in the art community, I think it's pretty clear you can establish a pedigree and see how that's filtered down into popular discourse about not just games, but about digital media in general. You can the constant assumption that you see in popular writers about digital media, like that. What is really new? This is not, you're just not repeating some old medium, but you're doing something new with the medium. That obsession, really, with defining the essence of the medium and advancing it in a teleological sense, I think that's relatively new. It's a discourse that's coming from, as I said, 20th century art discourse, but filtering down into popular. So I don't think this is not the way artists talk you can find analogies, but it's not the central artistic discourse for 500 years.
Let me say, I was a painting major for 3 years when I was, a bright-eyed 18-year-old kid in art school, and the way that we approached it was with a very ahistorical view. And as we've been researching this, you learn that we talk about, for example, we're throwing down Greenberg and it's about flatness, but we're omitting the fact that that dialogue of what materiality of painting is or what the essence of painting is was in constant revolution. And it is a 20th century notion to think that it's making some sort of progress somewhere, like we're getting better and better paintings. Greenberg denied that himself, but the way we talk about him, it's always as if he really thought that it was better. He kept denying that. So you have people like Greenberg saying it's about flatness, one of his proteges saying he was wrong. It's actually partially about the human body. It's about opticality. It's about the human eye and the human brain respond to images. And then Rosalind Krauss said, you both are screwed up. It's all social conventions. It's all bullshit. So, I mean, it's interesting just to look at the process of the discussion of materiality of painting.
I think Eric has got a point as Brian does. So this is part of a bigger discussion. So that might be second question there. So we are concentrating on games and art, which is like, as it so happens, the title of our part of the title of our conference. But could it be that, like the avant-garde or like Fluxus, where the artistic drive or the idea of the revolution, artist revolution, spilled over all kinds of media, that we are looking of a section of what's going on? So maybe games are not the core of the artistic movement that we try to grasp. Games are like one expression of the artistic ongoings that are here at the moment. And if could that be, and where are they?
I think that was kind of my entire point, is that these kinds of expressions, they're contextualized. So if you think about the stuff that the Dadaists were modding, they were at the sort of this very palpable moment of industrialism. And all those things, the urinal, the iron, all the things that Duchamp interacted with were sort of these mass-produced items that he was then transforming into art. And if you want to use, is it Benjamin, you guys are always talking about the aura? He added aura to things that didn't have it, right? So that, to me, is the same type of practice as dance, boldo, dance. It's the same urge to take a mass-produced popular culture or popular object that's an everyday object and use it as an expressive form. To me, it's just that, my students are of the generation where video games are their expressive forms. People in my generation, maybe a little older, were making video art. I remember when video art was blasphemous. It's a TV, it's not art. What are you talking about? But that's because those people were using the popular medium of their generation. So to me, I think they all come from the same core instinct of the avant-garde urge, which is to take the pieces of our culture and transform them through these kind of practices.
Can I add something to that? Going back to Hickey's essays, The Heresy of the Zone Defense, the point of the essay, really, which I didn't really talk about, is that games, if you consider basketball a game, have actually replaced art in public culture. That art has basically, basketball starts as this effort to control students and to create rules for them so that these unruly students aren't so unruly and so forth and so on. Art is public spectacle and culture at the end of the 19th century. At the end of the 20th century, games meaning basketball, sports, are public spectacle, and art is pedagogy and control and governed by by institutions and rules and things like that. That's kind of the argument. That's where he starts with Dr. J, and that's where he moves on. So in effect, games are actually closer. One could argue, and Hickey has argued, that games are closer to the ferment in public culture than art is.
I wanted to pick up the Cory Archangel thing brought up earlier and tie it in with Celia's point, where in the 70s you have video artists that are remixing videos, and you can see a lot of the tropes and the ways that they played with video now just exploded with YouTube and online video. So I think looking at Cory Archangel not as this, he's sort of ruining games or something, or he's like selling out for the man or whatever, even though it's not really how you guys talked about him, you could also look at it as a very inspirational moment where, okay, maybe 10 or 20 years in the future, people are remixing and modding games to that much of a degree in which they're remixing, modding videos with YouTube poop and stuff like that. So that makes him like one of the most inspirational game artists that I can think of. So.
Yeah, but that's actually a perfect example of what I'm talking about, the Cory Archangel piece, because it's exactly the same thing as the iron with the nails in it.
What I meant to say, too, is I forgot to leave, an important part of that piece is, of course, his website and the fact that he allows, he gives instructions. The first line is, first you're going to need a Super Mario cartridge. It's all about doing. So the way it's been, as Celia mentioned, it's really the gallery system made him look this way. It's not like his art is really just about looking. It's about engaging in sort of do-it-yourself culture.
And actually, the Fluxus, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but this actually, the problem that keeps coming up about Cory's work being presented as if it's video, which it's not, this plagued the Fluxus artists and still does to this day. I saw a Fluxus retrospective in London, and every single thing was under a glass case. And there was a huge controversy a couple of years ago where all those kits I was showing you were being auctioned like by Sotheby's and stuff, and nobody knew how to value them. You know, it's not like Michelangelo's David or something where, oh, this is one thing. And only. If you've got 20 plastic boxes with a bunch of springs in them, is that worth $10,000 because Yoko Ono made it? Or the 25 cents the pieces cost, right? So all of these avant-garde movements have also had this stress of they're not really comfortable in the traditional, whatever the traditional museum environment of the day might be.
So, Michael, the impetus for this most recent discussion was your question about whether games had to be seen as part of a larger phenomenon. And I think it seems that we're pretty much in agreement that we're comfortable with that notion. In other words, that this circle,
yes.
the magic circle of games is actually broken, and we're comfortable with seeing objects, quasi-game objects and processes and practices as being part of what we want to discuss. And my question is to the audience, aren't there people out there who are bridling at that? Because it seems to me that there's a strong current in the game studies community that wants to insist on the purity of the medium and on the separateness of games from other kinds of media forms and practices.
Which opens up the floor for the audience to
Can I just,
respond.
Michael, I want to say one quick thing in response to Henry's discussion earlier. I would argue that Guitar Hero does the thing that you were saying video games doesn't do, as do many Wii games, is that they've introduced this level of embodiment. I was at a Guitar Hero marathon in Nottingham in October. And, you know, pushing the buttons is one thing. You don't have to do this with the guitar, but everybody does it. So I think that form, that tension you're talking about between the form of expression and the, you know, achieving the goals of the game exists now with these new interfaces we have.
So next time I'll say without bodies with emphasis, because that's why I stuck in without bodies at the tail end. That's a game that involves the body.
I think that's good. I think that's progress.
Yeah.
Can we maybe get the first question?
Of course, yeah. So a question for the whole panel that I hope you all respond to very differently is the question of genre. So in games, we have kind of developed a whole taxonomy of genre. And I found it very interesting that the people working in avant-garde decided to kind of just say two avant-gardes. Not that that would be conclusive, but it kind of suggested, like, if you're looking at avant-gardes, there are two avant-gardes, and there you go. And I wonder if, you know, when you were doing your work, Celia, and looking over at these different movements, if you found it perhaps convenient to fit games back into existent kind of art paradigms and kind of read the present back into the past. Not that that's what you were doing. And then finally, with this idea of impressive play, I wonder if you would say that some games lean or have a certain propensity towards impressive play, whereas other games, oh, you could never play Stratego impressively or something. There would be some games where impressive play would be easier. So I wonder if you could just broadly speak to genreification in games.
Well, actually, the genre thing really, that kind of gets me worked up. So I actually have been in the video game industry since before there were genres. And for me, the emergence of genres was kind of, in a way, the death knell of creativity. By the time it was the late 90s and all the shelves were labeled a certain way and genres were proclaimed dead or alive or marketable or not, everybody was just putting themselves into the market boxes, and it's really annoying. What's really exciting to me right now, and why I'm kind of back in the fray of that side of things, is that people like Tale of Tales are basically whacking at the whole question of genre really hard with a hammer. And most of the people that I'm dealing with in IndieCade and the art scene, they're rejecting the tyranny of genre in a really palpable way that I find really exciting. It's like this whole renewal of innovation that's happening because they're rejecting that.
On impressive play, yeah. I would say my gut feeling is that there are games that are not conducive to impressive play, but I'm not going to name one, because if I name one, somebody's going to take up the challenge of showing me an impressive play using that game and prove me wrong within 24 hours. That's just the nature of it. What I want to say is, add to that, though, is that when I was writing another thing about Warcraft and sort of the nature of real-time strategy, a thought that occurred to me was an interesting thing about digital games in real-time strategy is that embodiment for the first time was important in the idea of a strategy game. Because of the interface mastery that's required to play those games at the top level, there's a lot of physicality, there are a lot of twitch skills involved in that. And in fact, that's one of the criticisms of some of the games, as opposed to chess. Does it matter how you move the chess piece? So I guess if okay, now I'm taking, here's the challenge. An impressive play in chess, absolutely. But that impressive play of chess is something you would normally read about on a page and understand in terms of the internal dynamics of the game. What a beautiful move, intellectually. But could somebody physically make a beautiful move in chess? I'll say, or an impressive move. So I'll be a dummy, and I'll say no. Okay?
With speed chess?
Yeah. Wow. See?
Snap.
I said 24 hours. It wasn't even 24 seconds. I mean, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Is that's part of it. That's what makes it impressive. It's unexpected. It's surprising. It's something you did not expect to happen. Dr. J did something that he wasn't really. It's not that he wasn't supposed to do. He didn't break any rules by doing it. Nobody did it, and of course, that's the nature of it. So if I say it can't be done, it's going to be done.
So I want to list as something I've seen be extremely physically impressive video game play is DDR, where somebody faces away from the screen, like nails it with a crowd around them.
DDR is the game I had in mind when I said without bodies. Absolutely. The freestyle, you know, it's unbelievable.
I gotcha.
Yeah.
And so I also want to ask, when you had the thing up there, and I know for the most part you said like both designers and players can be artists. It's not like they're one or the other. But for one, you had like Naismith versus like players like one or the other. And I'd like to point out that those are like mod rules on the engine, which kind of gets ignored when it's reality. Like when we're programming this stuff, we can't assume physics or rendering, etc., which seems like an unfair way to stack it against the designer, just in terms of complexity. But the next question just coming from the stuff, something like Harlem Globetrotters. Is there performance space in games that you've seen where it's not the optimal way to play, but people are just into watching it because it's snazzy enough?
And one. And would be an example of that in basketball. I'm sure 3 people know what I'm talking about. Is this performance troop of basketball basically that run around and do dribbling skills and all kinds of crazy shots and stuff like that? And yeah,
I was trying to ask it in the video games, in digital media space.
Speedrunning.
Speedrunning.
Yeah.
But so what I'm saying about Harlem Globetrotters, like Harlem Globetrotters aren't in the NBA because that's not the best way to play the game. Speedruns are actually like the fastest way to finish the game. It's still play optimal.
If anybody's interested, the game I showed that Julian Oliver level had, you got to check out the speed runs because they're like totally embodied with the cube flipping around and stuff. It's really cool.
Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that'd be great to talk about, you know, over coffee or some other beverage.
I was commissioned. Well, I was asked by PBS Art 21 to do a series of writing on art in immersive 3D space and 4D space. So I started interviewing a bunch of artists who were moving from being traditional visual artists to becoming full-fledged 24/7 Second Life artists, for example. So that included Beck's mother, B.B. Hansen, whose father was a Fluxus artist. Direct connection to Fluxus, and now she's in Second Life doing performances, but also Breno, who was a landscape painter, and she's in Canada, who now has basically doing these builds that remind me very much of Myst. Her Rabbitcorn build over the summer was at the IBM sim was basically reminded me of Myst, me playing Myst, and it was actually the same feelings, the same responses, and the instructions were very similar. So I find that the artists that are starting to use these virtual spaces are thinking about gaming as a way of discovery, as a way of immersing people who are participants, allowing participants to make decisions. And I find that, you know, the boundaries are blurring a little bit even more when I'm in these spaces, including the Fluxus happenings that I've been going to in Second Life as of late, that I never knew about because I've never been to a happening until now. So I just wanted to put the panel, because, you know, I think what's happening is there is a blurring of boundaries, and you know, what you might think about the artists like Breno and, you know, BBO, who, you know, Beck's mom. But I just throw that out there in terms of what's happening is you know, is a Myst-like experience, or is a game experience when you're in the space, but it's also an art piece.
I actually, there's a whole other talk I could have given here on productive play, which is one of my research areas in my MMOG work, and I think that some of the stuff that Henry showed overlaps with that, because there is this whole subset of activities that I think is tied really closely to hobby culture, actually, of people using game environments as a creative expressive medium. And I think that's it's a whole other area of the history of art games that we haven't really explored. Part of what's interesting is some of the things that you're seeing have actually been done in the past in university labs 15 years ago with $2 million machines that only 3 people ever saw. And what's really exciting now is that a lot of this stuff is just like the game modding, the moment when artists started taking on game modding as a mode of expression, that this is becoming more accessible. And what's really cool is that people can make these things in a place that's already public. I mean, Second Life is a public space, so you can go in there and make stuff and show it to people. And I think that's a really interesting, new, emerging kind of set of practices as well.
I'm sorry to follow up this just with a very small another question. So if like was just posed the question, if you can simply transform or implement a classical, so who's currently doing the voice reenactments in Second Life? The 01100. I'm sorry, I was. So they're doing the various reenactments of classical happenings in Second Life. So is this the same thing as the classical happening? Is this a digital remediation, reinterpretation, new arisen form of it, or is this something entirely different?
Well, I mean, my immediate response is it's not obviously not something entirely different because it immediately made you think of it, right? Classic answer would be that you can't repeat the avant-garde because once you've done it, the meaning of the repetition is different, and this is the problem that avant-garde theory, art theory, Peter Berger and others had to deal with. But it's obviously a very interesting phenomenon when you get a kind of historical consciousness that Celia's suggesting usually isn't there. When you see that actually happening, that's interesting. And when you see it happening in the context of blurring the boundary between art and games, or between technologically mediated forms and what is now traditional performance.
One word: remediation.
I promise not to interrupt.
Remediation is not avant-garde.
Well, actually, no. But the interesting thing to me about that as a performative gesture, right, is that it's an homage, but it's also its own thing. I mean, because of remix culture and using samples and all this other kind of stuff that we do now. I mean, I was kind of half joking, but it actually it's a great art piece in and of itself to do a happening in Second Life. I mean, if you're doing a Capro, it's particularly funny because his pieces were about like getting wet and soapy and rolling around on tires, and to make to make that into a virtual experience to me is kind of, it's ironic and really interesting actually as a choice for an artist to make.
I have a comment and then a question for the panel. The comment would be, as a former professional or semi-professional athlete and competitive Warcraft 3 player, I would kindly ask Mr. Lowood to get out of my brain because it's really scary. And my question is basically, why do you think there's the hesitation or the resistance to admit that there is some kind of possibility for cultural or political or social commentary through the way that someone plays a sport or a game? Like if you would ask, many soccer players, the way that Pelé played soccer was like a post-colonial commentary on, European colonialism or, something like that. Excuse me, something like that.
Well, physical sports, I think I've already raised this issue quite a bit, and of course, there are a lot of other issues involved. A primary one is race with sports, particularly in North America. Gumbrecht actually talks about that quite a bit because most of the athletes of the 20th century we have appreciated the most deeply in terms of the beauty of their athletic performance have been African American athletes. And in fact, the protests that I showed there briefly, the intrusion of the real world onto the athletic space, the fist salutes, also was tied up with racial politics in America. And I would be surprised if that wasn't a factor in the contemporary evaluation of that. I would expect there are a number of other issues involved, but that's certainly a practical one. Why there's clearly there's not much of a, let's put it this way, the other side of the coin of the fact that everyone appreciates, that the universal appreciation of the beauty of sports is at the surface level, the level of form, is also that people who don't appreciate the inside aspect of sports, that aspect of it, really don't know it's there. They really don't see it. And just like my point about Warcraft 3 is that what is perceived by a few tens of thousands of people in that community as a really beautiful and amazing move that's still talked about as lore in the community is invisible beyond that community. So that's a huge limitation in being able to translate the beauty of those games into something that becomes a more universal statement. You know, Hickey argues that Dr. J's move is something very important culturally, but you know, I think, you know, at his level of interpretation it certainly is, but the impact that it had on, you know, the issues that he talks about, which are political, the impact that that move had on those issues in the United States was nil, right? And I think it's because, in fact, a lot of people didn't appreciate the beauty of his move the way a basketball fan did, and so they couldn't possibly make that translation.
And the gatekeepers of that that would be making that judgment that haven't played basketball or haven't played Warcraft 3, so that, you know, ironically, it's not the people talking about games as art wouldn't think about that part of it. Potentially, is what I'm asking.
The rest of the panel, you're asking for that.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
It's my mistake.
Well, we're working on it. I think this is an event where issues like this probably bubble up, where we try to open the gates. I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I mean, can I just jump in? I think there was actually an interesting point to be made here, though, about broadly literacy or media literacy, right? Because, you know, I watch a football game and I can't tell mastery. I don't know anything about the game rules. I don't care. It's nothing to me. I know a little bit about basketball enough to appreciate the story that Henry was telling. A person from another country who's never seen the game would have no idea what that meant. Similarly, this literacy that Henry's alluding to with the professional video game players, I think is something that people have to learn, just like they have to learn to appreciate basketball. So as a spectator, and this goes back to art, right, there's also the literacy of knowing how to look at art, right? So I took a picture out of my slideshow, which is a very famous painting by a Chinese artist of Mao Zedong looking at the urinal. And it's this great picture because there's all these guys in the communist outfits kind of laughing and looking at this thing like, what is it? What is it? You know, and it's very interesting because it makes you realize, well, everybody has different literacies, and to some people that was just a urinal.
Yeah.
So I think as people that are curating game art exhibitions on a regular basis, I was telling someone earlier that the weirdest thing I find is when gamers come into game art exhibitions, if they're in a mod that's in a shooter, they'll just start shooting, even if there's nothing to shoot in the world.
Yeah.
And like, you know, there is a certain kind of literacy that we need to develop in these different contexts to understand what's going on.
So it goes both ways, is what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can we get the last 3 questions and then wrap it up, please? Thanks.
I want to extrapolate on the last question and also put the two talks sort of in dialogue by sort of bringing
Talk into the mic
I
so we
want to
can
bring
hear
up
you.
I want to bring up a moment in the history of games. It's really more than one moment, but the particular one is the moment in the early 70s when Atari decided to market Atari Basketball as a way for a small white boy to beat Kareem Abdul-Jabbar at basketball, right? And this puts precisely the racial history of sport in the context of video games, right? And it's actually much older and deeper than that even. You could go back and look at Robert E. Howard and his work in the Conan series and see that that's a very racially charged body of work, and see how it's very much about white male fantasy about conquering black bodies, essentially, and that this is precisely figured as a way of colonizing and structuring space and culture. And so if you guys could just speak to that.
Wow. It's been a long time since I've dunked. So the interesting thing, I think, in basketball, what I was going to say actually about I'm going to tie this actually with the question about women's basketball. To me, it's interesting that the internal skill of basketball, I was saying, that you see in the women's game just as well as you see in the men's game, you know, it's about passing to people and making decisions and so forth, like a point guard. that to me seems like the obvious thing to make a basketball game about, is to construct a basketball game that really emphasizes those kinds of decisions in the moment, how somebody distributes the ball, how somebody controls the team, that sort of thing. But what do most basketball games emphasize? They emphasize this fantasy of dunking the ball like somebody. The physical thing, the external aspect of the game, which I've been saying is not really part of the... And what you do to feel like you're dunking the ball is you manipulate the controller in a certain way, and then you see a graphic that's given to you of somebody making a spectacular dunk. And that becomes then somebody living this fantasy. And I think that that's kind of like a misplacement. I think maybe a game on women's basketball would really emphasize the kinds of decisions that would make a really interesting game, because they would emphasize the internal game. But because the women's game is not associated so much with the athleticism of the dunk and playing above the rim and all these kinds of crazy things, that game would be a better digital basketball game, because the player wouldn't expect to do those sorts of things.
So,
I mean, I've gone away from racial politics to more towards something that's more about gender politics. But I think that would be an opportunity there, because that to me seems like the part of the game that's more translatable into digital sports.
Can I just sort of mischievously ask a question? How is this not an essentialist definition of basketball? In other words, how is it that you're not deciding that this inner basketball game that only the expert, cadre of players and viewers can see and appreciate has greater value than what you call the external game that most of the spectators actually enjoy and prefer? And because the thing that puts me in mind of this is that, so you have players, and you've been concentrating on the players, but what about the spectators of basketball? Why is it that their perspective isn't also as legitimate?
No, well, I enjoy both equally personally, but, well, part of it is that basketball is the purpose of sport, and the problems that you're solving in basketball ultimately have to do with having the higher score at the end of the game, winning the game. So as some of the essays point out, I don't think I quoted any of the passages, well, maybe Gromala says this a little bit. He says he recognizes that his emphasis on beauty, on the external forms, is something that coaches and purists and so forth disagree with. He sort of puts that out there, and he argues. I mean, his book is an argument for basically what you just said, for basically these external forms, these moments, these surprising moments are universally accessible. There's something we're all grateful for. There's something everyone can appreciate. Everyone appreciates Ali and Pele and so forth and so on. And he argues that that is what is important. It's not so important who wins and loses the game. But the fact is that, if you look at it internally, people trying to win the basketball game, generally most people would agree that ultimately, and you see this sort of thing all the time, teamwork is better, coordination is better, solving the problems is better, and players like Tim Duncan, Derek Jeter, and so forth, those are really great players. Of course, somebody like Kobe Bryant does both, so he's great from both views of it. I think there are different relationships between spectator and performer around the sport. I wouldn't put personally. If you're saying I'm not really personally preferring one or the other, but I am pointing out that there are different kinds of relationships between the spectator and the performer in sports.
So I want to just reignite the Guitar Hero thing, because I think two things. One, I think that Nathan brought up a really, really interesting point about the pervasive fantasies that games embody in some way or another. And Guitar Hero is a great one. Someone said earlier, it's not about playing the guitar, it's about being a rock star, right? And rock bands similarly. And I literally sat for 8 hours and watched dozens and dozens and dozens of teenagers get up and play Lego Rock Band with all these different levels of mastery, and it was exactly the things that Henry's talking about. There was the mastery of the mechanics of the game, and then there was the performative aspect, and they dressed up, and they sort of carried this whole fantasy through in all these different ways. And I think that's kind of, to me, I see that same exact spectrum of things played out there as well. But it's also interesting just the starting point about what do we translate into a digital fantasy? Why? Who are we translating it for? I think it's a really, really compelling question.
Which I have to cut short for a second because we wanted to last 2 questions, please.
Okay, let's see. My name is Hoyt. I'm a small indie game developer, and I have a couple of my own masterpieces floating around out there. So my question is kind of addressing the blurring of the line between player and developer. I kind of see with all the new things coming out, including Second Life and some of Microsoft's development and lots of little indie game sites out there, that more and more people are developing their own games and their own game logics and their own game experiences and really questioning the foundation of what a game is and can do. How do you see that affecting the mainstream games and game publishers, game economics, and all, pretty much anything that that question could address?
We don't have enough time.
In 2 minutes.
I mean, this isn't an answer to the question, but it's at least a clue in which, it's a tool in which to think about it. I actually think Ralph Koster's participation pyramid is really useful here, where you have the broadest base of people at the bottom who don't modify their character in a game. And as you get up in the top of the pyramid, you have people who can just code games from scratch, like Julian Oliver. So the idea is, if you look at the history of video art, you have this, I don't want to use teleology or progression, but you just have more and more people able to participate at the higher levels of the pyramid of video. Hopefully we'll see that more in games, because you've already seen it in the past few years. So hopefully that trend will continue.
Yeah, I think there's two things going on there. I mean, like I said, I look at hundreds of these things every year for Indiecade. I think there's a couple of things going on there. One of them is that we have had more accessible technologies like Flash and modding of game engines. And on the other side, we have a bunch of people that reject all the built-in conventions of those technologies and build stuff from scratch or whack at them until they do something different. But there's also a growing literacy. I mean, I think that somebody like Julian Oliver paints with code. I mean, that's what he does, right? He can take a visual idea and an immersive idea and just create it with numbers. And I think more and more, I mean, the generation of students that our program is training are going to be able to do that increasingly. And they're going to make different choices than going to work for Electronic Arts.
So there seem to be three things, like new channels, like you said already, Explores Live. There seem to be people who teach, because that's how Julian Oliver basically makes his money. He teaches workshops. And then there is this pyramid that hopefully grows into a wider base that could feed this kind of new indie game scene there might be, if I summarize your statements half correctly.
It's interesting that it's the feeling I'm getting is very supportive feeling of welcoming instead of sort of a defending turf sort of sense. Personally, I like that a lot.
I was going to make an announcement during my talk, which I forgot about. Tomorrow at 7, the closing party is going to be a indie game slam where people can sign up kind of like an open mic format and share their games, so bring them on down. It'll be at the W, Midtown.
So we are welcoming. Can we get the last question, please, from Ben?
So, Henry, I really like your game archiving work, but you mainly talked about spectating real-time gameplay. And so I wanted to hear your thoughts on how you can actually combine that concept with sort of archiving the gameplay experience, like recording gameplay either for spectating later or for even interacting with it later, like with player ghosts.
Yeah, just let me preface that by saying that, so I'm putting another hat on. I do a lot of work on game preservation and stuff like that. As you can probably tell from the talk, the one connection is that what I'm really interested in the game archiving side is trying to push the paradigm of software preservation as what game preservation is about to forms of preservation that will provide documentation about events and experiences that people had in these spaces. Because I think that being able to just run a version of Quake 100 years from now or World of Warcraft is going to be a pretty dull thing to do if that's your entire body of documentation to talk about them. What you want to have is you want to have documentation of what people really did in these spaces. And so I'm very interested in things like how do we preserve things like replays. I'll give you, I'll give one, maybe I'll just tell one little story and I won't go into a lot of detail and that'll be it, and we can talk later. The replay I showed you. So I was head referee of this tournament, and as head referee, I walked over to every night I would walk over with my little flash drive and I would take all the replay files. I don't know if I was supposed to do that, but I did. So I had all the replay files from the tournament, all the matches, And when I wanted to do these presentations, what I do with with the video the one video of mine that worked today that I ran of the actual match I was talking about, is on occasion I've shown that to people and just said, okay, who can tell me what just happened? Provocatively, just because usually nobody can. But to make that video, well, that's version 1.14, I think, of Warcraft 3, something like that, when the tournament was held. I think it's like 24 or 25 right now. And every time the game is patched to another version, the capacity to play replay files in the previous versions is lost. So, huge problem. So basically, all those, to really document the complete history of a game like Warcraft 3 in terms of replays of games and so forth and so on, we would have to be able to run every version of Warcraft 3, which I can tell you from having done the work to rerun the version to play the replay a year later, was hellacious work. I mean, it's really hard to do. We don't have things like a version, a piece of software you can say, I want to run version 1.12 to run this replay, and or maybe 1.18 to run this version. It doesn't exist right now. So that's a huge problem for this kind of documentation. I can't run the replay of this game that I want to talk about on the current version of Warcraft 3 that I will have running on my PC at home. I have to somehow find this older version, unpatch, reverse patch all the way back, 10 versions or so. And right there, I mean, that's a problem that's very difficult to solve, and to think about how you would put that kind of stuff, both the software and the replays, into a repository and make them available to somebody to look at later. And then you can go from there to the same sorts of problems if you're thinking about events that happen in a virtual world. Well, it gets much tougher when you start talking about that. So I'll just leave it there, and maybe we can talk a little bit about it later.
We had the same problem yesterday, right? And we were talking about curating, and it will be the same problem probably tomorrow. We have the question, how do we actually view, keep, and discuss these things? So we have to leave it here because we have to clear the room. Thank you very much to all the panelists and speakers.